Hello and welcome to video 2 for Development and Learning, Unit 3. This video will be focusing on the physical development of humans over the course of a lifespan. By the end of this video, you should be able to answer the following question. How does physical development throughout the lifespan apply to behavior and mental processes? So let's start actually before we are born. At the prenatal development. Conception is the moment when a male's sperm fertilizes a female's egg. At this point, the one sperm meets the one egg, and the egg will create a barrier around that sperm to block out all of the other sperm that are trying to come into the egg and fertilize it. Women are born with all of the eggs they will ever have, and actually only one out of every 5,000 of those eggs will mature. Men, however, begin producing sperm at puberty and will produce it 24/7 for the rest of their life. If we're talking about the physical development, we can't not talk about the genetics of what is actually contained inside of that egg and that sperm. So the sperm carries 23 chromosomes and the egg carries 23 chromosomes, and those combine to create the 46 chromosomes that most humans will be born with. This new cell, or zygote, with the fertilized egg contains 23 paired chromosomes at this point. One member of the pair from the mother and one member from the father. Each chromosome then contains thousands of genes, and these genes, either individually or in combination, produce a particular set of characteristics that we have as humans. Each gene is composed of sequences of DNA. So let's talk about the sex of the baby then. The mother can only produce X chromosomes. So the mother will produce an X. The father, on the other hand, can provide either an X or a Y chromosome. And so depending on what the father gives, baby will then become either a biological male or a biological female. Once the egg is fertilized, we now have what is called gestation. And our 3 stages of gestation are zygote, embryo, and fetus. Zygote is our very first stage, and this starts at 2 weeks gestation. Why 2 weeks and not right away, 0 weeks? Well, that's because our gestational age actually starts counting from the day 1 of the mother's last menstrual cycle. So every woman will technically be 2 weeks pregnant until that egg is released and either fertilized or not fertilized. If the egg is not fertilized, the woman will release that egg and the lining of the uterus will shed along with that egg, and the woman will have a menstrual cycle. If the egg is fertilized at that 2-week mark, then it becomes a zygote. By the 3rd week, the egg now becomes an embryo, and this stage lasts from about that 3rd week through the 8th week. After it hits the 9th week of gestation, now the fertilized egg, the embryo, will be called a fetus. Women usually won't find out that they were pregnant until the embryonic stage, usually in the 4th or 5th week of gestation. However, sometimes people don't find out until much later. Throughout gestation, there are things that can influence the development physically and mentally. These are called teratogens, and teratogens are harmful agents that reach the embryo and or the fetus during prenatal development and can harm the baby's development. One teratogen that you should know about is alcohol, and too much alcohol during gestation can lead to what is called fetal alcohol syndrome. And fetal alcohol syndrome can cause heart, bone, kidney problems, can cause behavioral and learning disorders. There are also physical disformities that come along with fetal alcohol syndrome. This includes abnormally small eyes and an upturned nose. Usually there's also an abnormally or small brain that has been formed during development. Most babies that are born with fetal alcohol syndrome will have some degree of mental retardation, which means a slowing of the cognitive development. And many exhibit signs of problems with attention span, learning, coordination, and behavior. Other drugs serve as teratogens as well. Illegal drugs like cocaine can result in a baby being born addicted to the drug, and even some legal drugs can cause fetal abnormalities like alcohol and nicotine. But there are other teratogens that can cause harm that a mother doesn't purposely put into her body. And these teratogens might come in the form of illnesses. For example, German measles or rubella can cause blindness, deafness, heart abnormalities, and stillbirth. Syphilis can cause mental retardation, physical deformities, and miscarriage for the mother. And AIDS can be passed on to the child prior to birth and during birth. So again, teratogens are things that are going into the body, external substances that are going into the body that can cause harm to the child. Other physical things that can impact development are genetic mutations. This is where one or more genes is mutated during the development process. And this one example of this would be PKU. And PKU is a genetic disorder characterized by an inability of the body to utilize the essential amino acid phenylalanine. So newborn development, we start the very first gauge of development right away, right after birth. And this is measured using the APGAR scale. This is a test given to newborns right away at birth and then 5 minutes later. The APGAR scale tells us a little bit about the physical nature of the infant. It tells us about their activity and whether they're using their limbs, their pulse, their grimace, which is their reflexability. We'll talk about those in just a second. Their appearance, so what their skin looks like, and then their breathing or respiration. This APGAR scale is a really great way for doctors to make a quick assessment of the child's development and address any concerns right away. Like we said, one of the ways that we determine the physical development of newborns are their reflexes. And there are a few reflexes that you should know. First is the Moro or the startle reflex. This is where babies will outstretch their arms and fling back their neck when there is a loud noise or a sudden physical change, like they're being put down onto a bed. This is because they are getting ready to fall. And so they're outstretching their arms and flinging back their head in order to protect their neck and the rest of their body. The next reflex is the Babinski reflex. And this is where an infant will respond to a touch on the bottom of the foot and their toes will splay outwards. So kind of go like this and arch backwards. In adults, the toes actually curl inwards and you don't want them to splay outwards. That can give a response that someone has no more brain activity. In newborns, they also have the sucking reflex, the rooting reflex, which is their ability to turn their head towards something that is touching their cheek. The grasping reflex, you can often see babies grabbing onto a finger or an object. The swallowing reflex, so if something is in their mouth, they will swallow. And then finally, kind of a weird one is the stepping reflex. And this is where if the feet are just touching the ground, the infant will show that they are walking or showing movements that they are walking along that surface. After the newborn stage, infants and children develop in many different ways, and we know many of these milestones. And we're going to talk about each one of these as we go. One of the issues that we talk about in developmental psychology is this idea of continuity versus stages. And one of the things that most pediatricians agree upon is that there aren't very clear ages when babies will do a certain physical milestone. However, there is a range that babies should be performing these developmental milestones. And if they aren't meeting those stages, then we should be questioning whether or not there's something wrong with that infant. Now, babies will progress through these at their own pace. However, most babies will go through these stages in order. This process of physical development is what we call maturation. And this is the biological growth process, uninfluenced by experience. So it's our sequence of motor development. And this is really universal. Babies will go through the following stages in order, but that timing, again, is individualistic. So rolling over, crawling, walking, sitting unassisted. Some of the things you should know: rolling over. So babies will roll over around the age of 3 months. And so here's a short video to show you that rolling over process.
Come here, come get this. Come on, you can get it.
The next stage is sitting unsupported. This happens around the age of 6 months. The next stage is crawling or scooting. Around 8 or 9 months, babies will start this crawling. The next stage is the beginnings of walking. This might include some help or some assistance from an adult to get them started to balance. And then finally, babies will walk on their own, usually by the age of about 15 months. Some babies, again, will do it before that. I love this stage. They look like little drunk sailors when they're finally walking unassisted. So like I said before, these stages do happen usually in order. They're not going to do one of these things before the other. However, the timing of these happen at their own pace. One of the things that we have tried to come up with different ways to test for are the things that we know that we have, the things that we can do as adults or older children. When exactly do they develop in our life? And so one of the ways that we have come to test this is using the visual cliff experiment. This was conducted by Gibson and Walk in 1960, and they wanted to see when depth perception was developed in infants. And so what they did is they created an illusion. They created this table where infants could crawl across. One of the parts of the table was patterned. The other part was just glass, but the pattern was underneath that glass. What they found is that depth perception is actually pretty much an innate ability, because babies were able to do this as early as they were able to crawl. Now, one of the problems with this is that we don't know if babies can do it before they can crawl, because they have to be able to crawl in order to do this experiment. But we have determined that depth perception from at least this experiment develops very, very early on in our development. Okay, let's now talk about adolescent development. This is the next stage of physical development that we have, and this is where we get to talk about the fun stuff, the stuff that you're experiencing right now. First thing that we need to talk about is what adolescence is. Adolescence is the period of human development that starts with puberty, around the age of 10 to 12. And this extends through physiological maturity, approximately the age of 19. So that age kind of varies across individuals, but it's really until you physiologically, so physically, stop development. Puberty is the stage of development when the genital organs reach maturity and secondary sex characteristics begin to appear, signaling the start of adolescence. It's marked by either the first ejaculation of sperm in the male, spermarchy, or the onset of menstruation in females, menarche. It's also seen by the development of breasts in females, and in both male and females, the growth of pubic hair and increasing sexual interest. You heard me talk about secondary sex characteristics, so let's define what the difference between primary and secondary sex characteristics are. First of all, sex characteristics are any of the traits associated with sexual identity. Primary sex characteristics, for example, testes in males or ovaries in females, are directly involved in the reproduction of the species. So this would include the first menstruation and the first ejaculation. Secondary sex characteristics are features not directly concerned with reproduction, such as voice quality, facial hair, and breast size. These things happen because of those primary sex characteristics maturing. During this time period, adolescents also are developing their gender identity. So in psychology, it is important for us to understand the difference between gender and biological sex. Biological sex is going to be whether or not the person is born with an XX chromosomes or XY chromosomes, and we determine that to be biologically male or biologically female. Gender, on the other hand, is the social construct of what we determine to be female versus male. This is constructed completely through society and what we determine appropriate for each biological sex. These gender characteristics change over the course of the lifespan, as well as throughout history and from culture to culture. So when we are talking in psychology about gender and sex, biological sex is determined at the point of conception, whereas gender is learned throughout our lifespan. The next stage of physical development we should talk about is adulthood and aging. There are three different stages of adulthood. The first is early adulthood, and this is usually in the 20s and 30s range. At the very beginning of this, we have emerging adulthood, which is right at the beginning of the 20s, sometimes the very late teens. And this is when the person is done with adolescence, but they're not really ready for full adult responsibilities yet. This person may also be struggling with identity. Usually, emerging adulthood is going to be senior year of high school, maybe freshman year of college. So right between that 18 to 20 range, when the person is, physically developed, but they're not quite ready for all of what adulthood is. The next stage is middle adulthood, and this is from your 30s to your 60s. Physical ability is starting to decline at this point. So you reach your peak in your 20s, and then by your 30s, everything is starting to go downhill physically. Fertility is also declining. And then toward the end of middle adulthood, women are going to experience menopause, which is the point in their life when they can no longer reproduce. Finally, late adulthood is going to be 60s and onward. And this is going to be the point in the person's life when, again, their physical ability is still starting to decline and the person is experiencing things like retirement.